At some point in this journey, it is necessary to address the notion of peace and conflict. These are two concepts that are often considered to be polar opposites, two extremes of the human experience. However, as we begin to embrace the transrational paradigm and we begin to leave behind the mechanistic and Cartesian views of the world, and in particular, as we learn to shed our binary and rigid understandings of concepts like peace and conflict, or war and peace, violence and nonviolence. Embracing the transrational paradigm means transcending this dualistic understanding of the world, and in its place, choosing to explore much more complex and ambiguous understandings and concepts. This is Peace and Conflict Fundamentals. I am Andres Jimenez. And so, if we were to explore the notion of conflict from a transrational perspective, this would mean moving away from understandings focused exclusively on bad or negative conceptions, and instead, it proposes that we see conflict in terms of an event that occurs when we have an imbalance within the system. If we take a closer look at the notion of homeostatic balance, we can understand that the nature of different systems is to oscillate continuously until they're able to return to a certain level of balance. Every force creates a counterforce or reaction, much like power will always spawn counter reactions that seek to oppose and challenge the ability of this power to dominate and control. An imbalance in a system will cause a counter effect that we normally describe, characterize, or experience as a conflict. If, for example, members of a company feel that they have been taken advantage of by the owner of the company, who they accuse of not paying them a fair wage or honoring pre-agreed benefits, they are convinced that there is a clear imbalance in the professional relationship, and as a result, their attempts to correct this wrong will be perceived by the owner as a conflict. And so, the turbulence that occurs within the system as it seeks to return to a state of rhythmic balance is often perceived by us as a conflict. Now, this alternative understanding also requires that we move away from strict moral interpretations of conflict that instruct us to label the idea of conflict with a strict negative connotation. Yes, often we have seen and experienced the violent and brutal effects of conflict. But again, the notion of homeostatic balance reminds us of the need to consider the opportunities and potential that conflict can also present. As we saw in the previous example, conflict can also be an opportunity for much needed transformational change. It can be the opportunity for people that have traditionally been the victims of an imbalance in the system to redress their situation. Now, of course, this return to a position of dynamic balance is rarely a linear and direct process. Now, in the same way, much has been written and discussed regarding the concept and the idea of peace. From a mechanistic perspective, we can see the simple definition of peace as being the absence of conflict. Or we can also come across the use of dualistic concepts such as negative and positive peace. Negative peace being the direct absence of violence, and positive peace being a more proactive approach to creating the necessary conditions for a peaceful and harmonious coexistence. I personally prefer to rely on an approach that describes 5 general families or 5 clearly identifiable understandings of peace. And so we can begin by exploring what can be called or identified as a moral interpretation of peace, in which peace is understood from a dualistic perspective, where there is a clear separation from what is divine, which is true and perfect, and what is human, which is considered as flawed and deeply imperfect. And this is an understanding that calls for the pursuit of peace through the search for truth, which will be determined by the justice system. And as a result, a moral interpretation of peace is an approach that relies on the legal system, either national or international, as well as the adequate implementation of traditional norms and customs as the path towards achieving peace. And so we can say that this understanding is grounded on the notion of peace out of a single truth. Now, we can also talk about a modern interpretation of peace, which is supported by an understanding of peace as something that can be achieved through reason. In other words, peace can be achieved through the rational analysis and pursuit of the key elements identified by experts with the necessary knowledge and information. This is an understanding that stems from a profound reliance on a mechanistic view of the world, a view in which conflict is understood as the breaking down of a system. And so, peace work is the act of repairing the failure or of optimizing and updating the system. And so, peace can be reached or rendered more likely through a focus on development and growth. Just like moral interpretations of peace, modern understandings also support an understanding of the peace worker, the specialist, or the expert as impartial actors with the capacity to bring peace to a conflict. But at the same time, the peace worker or the expert can remain distant from the conflict that she is working on because she is not a part of the conflict. This person's expertise and knowledge allows her to decontextualize the process through which peace is reached, because peace is understood as an universal concept that can be attained through the correct implementation of best practices and the latest theories in the field. And so we can say that the modern understanding of peace is grounded on the notion of peace out of reason. And this understanding has been the one that has traditionally dominated the fields of development and peace and conflict studies for decades. Now, moral and modern understandings of peace are in a very similar spectrum within the peace families, and concepts and practices such as peace building, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, or post-conflict fall very much within these understandings of peace. Now, in the other spectrum of the peace families, we can find other interpretations of peace. Like, for example, the postmodern interpretation of peace, which is an understanding that seeks to transcend the moral and modern interpretations of peace in order to embrace the notion of doubt and uncertainty. A postmodern interpretation of peace questions the complete reliance on reason and procedures, which are the foundations of the moral and modern interpretations of peace. And in its place, it proposes an acceptance of the diversity of human relations, as well as notions of truth, which are much more varied and specific to the different human experiences. And as a result, this understanding proposes a deeply local and contextual approach to peace work, an approach in which differences are celebrated instead of something that needs to be overcome. And there is also a recognition that peace can never be a stable concept, but instead it is a profoundly fluid and ever-changing condition. And so we can say that a postmodern understanding of peace is grounded on the notion of peace out of diversity. In the similar spectrum of the peace families, we can also find what can be called an energetic interpretation of peace, which is an understanding that values the notion of peace as a condition that can occur as a result of a harmonious balance of energies. Peace is understood from a holistic perspective, since the individual can never be separated from the divine and the cosmos. This understanding holds that peace will be found in the exploration of the spiritual and the divine realms. And as a result, it accepts the notion that to define, contain, or reproduce peace is impossible, because it is a condition that can only be experienced. And the mere act of trying to directly describe peace will require us to switch to a modern perspective and the use of our rational mind. And so we can say that an energetic understanding of peace is grounded on the notion of peace out of spirituality. And lastly, we can talk of our final understanding within the peace family, and that is the transrational understanding of peace. And this is a conception which represents a dynamic embrace of all of the four previously mentioned understandings. It is an attempt to reconcile the modern and the moral understandings of peace with the energetic and the postmodern ones. We can be at the same time deeply moral and rational, as well as spiritual and energetic beings. We don't actually have to choose one or the other. We should instead embrace the strengths that all of these understandings can offer. Transrationality is not an opposition to modernity, but it is instead a recognition that modern and moral understandings of peace are simply too reductionist and fail to account for the full spectrum of human experiences and realms. It is an understanding that focuses on identifying and working with interwoven networks instead of individual elements. And as a result, the Cartesian distinction of mind and matter, or observer and observed, can no longer be upheld. It is an understanding that recognizes that your mere presence in a dysfunctional system makes you a part of the conflict. It recognizes that the conflict will live in you as well, and that neutrality and objectivity are aspirational concepts, because in reality, you bring your full baggage to the conflict, and in return, the conflict will also have an effect and a profound influence in you. Transrationality is an understanding that is grounded on the notion of peace out of harmony. And as a result, it is an approach that is not really focused on changing the elements already present in the system, but rather It is interested in transforming the relationships among these elements. And it is an understanding that sees peace as a deeply personal, context and time specific experience that is in constant transformation. This means that for transrationality, there is no final stage called peace. It is rather a dynamic condition that is never stable and which changes at every single moment because it is deeply embedded in the human experience and in the inherent transformational nature of all living systems. And so, this means that from a transrational perspective, we should actually speak in the plural term transrational pieces. Elicitive conflict transformation, harmony, and the healing of relationships are all concepts that fall very much within this alternative spectrum of the peace families. It is up to you to choose which understanding of peace and conflict you feel more comfortable embracing. The options are numerous, and each interpretation offers its own set of challenges and complexities. The choice is yours, but choose carefully, because your work and how you continue to see the world around you will be directly influenced by this choice.